My name is Clark Travis. I was a search and rescue ranger for the Tennessee Park Service. I'm going to tell you my strangest encounter to date. Working for the Park Service, I witnessed and heard many strange things. Being in the great outdoors so much of your working life, it's hard not to encounter some unexplainable events. My buddies had many more tales than I did, though. But the one truly strange and unexplained event that I was a part of beat theirs hands down. It was high summer in eastern Tennessee. Families crowded the parks and campgrounds. The mountains were green, wildlife at its peak, fish plentiful, and the urge to get out into the wilderness with family and friends was high. That made my job a bit busier than usual. Midsummer through mid-autumn was always my busiest time. Everything from lost pets to injured campers and hikers fell in my lap. Hell, I loved the job though. I think the adrenaline rush of the more dangerous situations is what kept me coming back year after year. Back in the early 90s, not many people had cell phones, GPS trackers, or any sort of mobile electronics really. Not around here, anyway. If there had been, maybe we would have all located lost hikers easier. Maybe they wouldn't have gotten lost to start with. I don't know. Who knows? The wilderness plays by its own rules, in my opinion. No matter how well prepared you think you are, well, the woods can always find a way to prove you wrong if it wants to. Reporting to the station early one morning to start my shift, I got a call. John, a young man camping on his own, had not returned home when he said he would. The mother, worried and in a panic, had called in his disappearance, and now it fell to me to go out and try to find him. The info sheet I had been given only described the general location of his campsite, and it was only what John had told his mother before leaving on the week-long vacation. In my experience, the younger campers, especially the ones going it alone, rarely are wherever they say they're going to be. Now in Tennessee, there are a myriad of camping spots that are not in the designated campgrounds. Hell, people start walking through the woods at random and just pitch a tent wherever they feel like it. After all, it's very unlikely that they'll get into any trouble or be spotted at all by anyone. Do they really consider the dangers of giving the wrong information to loved ones? No, not a single one that I had to find did. They don't think anything of it all, actually. Mostly their intentions were innocent enough. They just wanted to explore a little further, go a little deeper and get a little farther away from the campgrounds and people. And then, voila, they end up lost and in a few days, didn't return when they should, and I or another member of search and rescue had to go track them down. Thankfully, all my rescues had survived. There were scared shitless or injured or half-starved by the time I found them, but they all made full recoveries. Now, I hope the same would be true for young John. At age 19, what did he really know about wilderness safety? Had he prepared for the possibility of becoming lost out there? The park closest to his supposed campsite was a place crammed to capacity with families. The river snaked by, its dark waters glimmering under the bright sun as kids splashed near the shore. The more adventurous people swam out farther, letting the current carry them to the steep bend where a small beach provided a place where teenagers liked to sunbathe, play, and just enjoy the long, lazy days. According to my information, John's campsite was at the end of the winnowing, craggy road that split through the lightly forested park. Even driving, it took nearly 15 minutes to reach the site. Going was slow because of the narrow, winding road and people walking to and from the open riverbed area. Now, a group of people stood in a cluster near the last designated camping area. A large tent loomed behind them, with a couple and their two small children milling around in front of it, Before I stepped out, I knew what I was going to hear. I had already pegged the most distraught-looking woman to be John's mother. The short, robust woman with silvering hair rushed to me as soon as I cut the engine, her eyes burning with fear and hope simultaneously. She shoved a 5x7 picture of her son into my hands and frantically told me someone else was in his camping spot. I took the picture and I reassured her he was probably just outside the campground, probably decided to stay an extra couple of days because it was so nice out there, yada yada yada. All my worries were packed in the back of my mind, where they would remain until and if I found John. The couple with the kids didn't know anything about him. They had already spoken with John's family members. They had been at their site for a week, and there had been a family there before them. No single men, no young man alone. Now my search took me past the perimeter of the campground and park, and like many others before him, I suspected John had just gone far enough into the woods to be away from the cooking smells and noise of the campground. Not to mention, there was no fee to camp in the woods, as there was at the park. There was a flat clearing on top of a small peak about an hour's hike from the park where teens sometimes went to party, and I had broken up more than one of the little illegal shindigs there in my time as a ranger. That would be my first stop. It didn't take long to be away from the noise of the park. The full, dense foliage soaked up sound like a dry sponge soaking up water. As I walked the path, I took special note that the dirt looked undisturbed. Several times, I stopped to scan the surrounding undergrowth. It also seemed undisturbed, at least by human. There were a few places where deer had stopped to eat, but nothing that even slightly looked like a human had been through since the beginning of summer. With the clearing in sight, I realized how quiet the forest had become. The usual cacophony of birdsong was absent, as was the scurrying of small creatures, most notably squirrels. They have the uncanny ability to sound like a virtual army, when in reality, it will only be a single small critter that could fit in the palm of your hand, and our forests are chock full of them. Most will pay little attention to a human unless said human gets too close, but they always scurried around, making all kinds of racket. The lack of normal forest background noise unnerved me, sent a chill all over my body. The clearing was empty, and looked as if it had been all summer. There was just some litter from past occupants, but it was old and the weeds had overtaken most of it. Standing in the center, I turned to take in the lay of the land and look for signs of other, smaller trails leading away from the place. One deer trail, and the bigger one I had just taken were it. John wasn't there, and he hadn't been there in the past week. As I trekked down the side, toward a wide ravine where kids also like to hang out, I spotted a Reese's Cup wrapper tumbling over moss-covered deadfall. The wind kicked it around easily, suggesting it hadn't been there long. I snagged it by a corner and brought it to my nose, and a faint whiff of the candy it once held was still evident, but it was very faint. I stuffed the wrapper into a baggie and put it into my pack, and I kept walking in the direction it had seemingly come from. And within a few feet, I found one of the empty inner wrappers with peanut butter still stuck to the bottom. I placed it in the bag with the outer wrapping and hurried in the direction I had been headed. Now, cresting over the ridge that showed the whole of the huge ancient ravine, I could just make out a green patch that seemed unnatural in its square shape through the leaves of the saplings. Carefully, I inspected the slope before descending. The leaf-covered drop-offs could be fatal. Cupping my hands around my mouth, I yelled John's name. My only answer was a hollow echo of my own voice. No startled birds flew away. No animals stopped their foraging to watch me. The forest was eerily silent, except for the rattle of leaves in the wind. I yelled again, and I got no response. My palms sweated as I started the climb down. If John was there in what I suspected was a tent, he was unwilling or unable to yell back to me. Now, I'd never found a dead person before, and I didn't want this to be my first. Especially after I had just assured his mother everything would be okay less than 2 hours earlier. Near the bottom, the ground was soft and gave way under my weight. I grabbed onto a sturdy pine tree to keep from falling into the thinly veiled rocks at the bottom, peeking from under their scrim of last autumn's leaves. Pulling my foot from the spongy dirt, I froze as a snake slithered within inches of my boot. Copperheads are notorious and plentiful here, and unlike most snakes, a copperhead will lay in plain sight, camouflaged perfect with its coppery and brown surroundings, until some unwary soul steps close enough for it to bite. They're practically invisible until it's too late. Sweat popped out at the back of my neck, and I searched for more copperheads before I set my foot down again. Looking back to where the square patch of green had been, I could make out the shape of the pop-up tent. Not perfectly square, more like an igloo-shaped. I yelled for John again, and just like before, there was no answer. Now, picking and choosing my steps carefully, I made my way slowly toward the tent, keeping my eyes on the ground directly around me. Had John maybe been bitten by a copperhead? Was he lying in his tent, perhaps dead for days? My stomach twisted and knotted. What if more than one snake had gotten to him? My skin crawled and my scalp tightened. A few yards from the site, I saw a torn flap of the tent rising and falling with a slight burst of air movement that found their way into the ravine. "Hey, John? If you're in there, buddy. I'm Park Ranger with Search and Rescue. My name's Clark Travis and I'm here to help. Your mother's worried sick." I waited, and there was no reply. Sidestepping, I edged closer, certain I would find his decaying corpse boiling with maggots inside the tent. The tent's side had been shredded. I could see inside. John wasn't there. Forgetting the snakes for the moment, I rushed towards the tent. The front looked like Freddy Krueger had gone crazy on it. Filaments of material flapped and twisted, trailing the unraveling strings behind them like tiny banners. The sleeping bag inside was rumpled near the front of the tent, still zipped almost all the way closed and unharmed. The top of the tent was intact, as if whatever had shredded the side and front had completely missed it in the frenzy to get at John. I touched nothing. Taking off my pack, I took out my camera and started snapping shots of the entire scene. As I repacked the camera, another bold orange Reese's wrapper skittered toward the fire pit. Another chill crept up my spine, settling in that spot on the back of my neck. I think you know the spot. It's where your skin tightens and the fine hairs stand on end when someone is staring at you, usually from behind. And suddenly, I felt very exposed and very trapped by the rising slopes on all three sides of me. It was as if someone had trained the crosshairs at the back of my head, and any moment I would hear the crack of a gunshot just before the world went dark and I ceased to be. I stood with my back to a tree and scoured the ridges for movement. It actually would have been a great relief to spot a black bear watching me, but there was nothing. See, I was alone. I was completely alone except perhaps for a few snakes. I took out the camera again and I snapped shots of the surrounding ridges. It wasn't unheard of to see some animal in them later, or even a person. I snapped quickly, turning in a full circle and hoping the images didn't blur. After several minutes, I convinced myself it was safe, and I began searching for clues as to where the boy could have been dragged or taken away from the tent. I didn't find a thing. No signs of blood or drag marks, or even footprints that suggested someone or something had carried him out of there. But what I did find were several small, intentional mounds of stones near the opening of the ravine. They had been placed in a semicircle at the opening. As I took pictures of them, I noticed more of the tiny mounds skirting the perimeter of the makeshift campsite. I followed the circle. Each mound had been precisely stacked and positioned. Some were in plain view, others were almost hidden under the low, growing greenery. How I had totally avoided stepping on one as I made my way to the tent, well, I have no clue. But none seemed disturbed. The mounds were about 4 or 5 inches in diameter and stood between 3 and 4 inches high, each topped with a round, white pebble. And I had to wonder, had John put them there? Was it some kind of a religious thing? Or had they been there all along? I had no way of knowing for sure, but as they were all still standing, I assumed they had been put there pretty recently. I widened my search and found nothing, and it was time to call in the police. Facing John's mother with no good news was one of the worst experiences of my life. The poor woman broke down, and I couldn't even offer her any comfort. What I did know was that no animal placed those stones around John's campsite, and no animal would have shredded his tent that way, leaving the inside almost pristine. Nor would an animal carried him away, whether he was alive or dead, without leaving a trail of some kind. Blood, drag marks, paw prints, or hell, all of the above. No, something else had happened to John. Weeks passed as the cops searched and investigated, and more teams with canines were called in. Helicopters buzzed the mountains, water rescue worked the river. Nothing turned up. John, for lack of a better phrase, had vanished without a trace. I kept my position as a rescue ranger for a few more years, but it was never the same. I never quite enjoyed it as I had before. And each time I had to go into the woods to search for someone's lost dog or some unlucky and lost hiker, I had the distinct feeling of being watched. As if I were in the crosshairs again. Now, I'm retired from the job and living in my cabin alone. The feeling of being watched had never followed me here. Not until about one day, 3 weeks ago. And from that day, I've mostly stayed inside with an ever-increasing amount of paranoia, even about opening the windows. I was sure someone was out there, and I was sure they meant me harm for some reason or another. It was the feeling I got that same day at John's campsite years and years and years ago. Just yesterday, I went outside to try and push through that feeling just as I had all those years ago, breaking the panic, reining it in before it can run completely wild is a necessity if you ever want to live a semblance of a normal life. And the first thing I saw when I stepped onto the porch was a perfectly and intentionally set small mound of rocks directly in front of my steps. Looking to each side, I followed the line of tiny stone mounds, capped with the one white, round pebble, all the way to each side of the house. where I knew they continued to form a perfect circle around my cabin.